hunting,
fishing,
cooking,
camping,
conservation,
travel,
gardening,
photography, family.
Family.
This is the Outdoor Ruhls Podcast. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Outdoor Ruhls Podcast. You know, I am so excited for our guest this week. I'm just going to kick this off because I know we have so much to talk about. Pat, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, Mike. Yeah, I'm Pat Durkin. I live in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I'm a outdoor writer. I guess I've been at it now almost 42 years, and I worked everything from newspapers to magazines, and in more recent times, the last 25 years, I've been freelancing full time and writing, editing, and now that I'm getting late in my career, I'm dialing things back a little bit, but I'm still writing for MeatEater and several Wisconsin newspapers, a weekly column I do for them. So it's the best way I can describe it is I would always try to do my writing and editing in a way where I never say no. I take on jobs that I probably shouldn't sometimes, but if you want to make a living at this, you have to be hustling the whole time.
Yeah, and Pat, I'm just so excited to talk to you about all this because it really feels like magic to me, and I am so impressed by people like you. Outdoor writing, I feel like, has been something that's been so important to me almost from the time, you know, that I could read. And it only occurred to me somehow kind of much later in life that there were real people behind this craft. And maybe that sounds totally silly, but, you know, it's amazing to me to have met somebody like you and to have this time to sit down with you. And so I have just about a million questions for you.
Good.
So I think I know a little bit about you. You about your personal story. You were born in Madison, Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, I was born back in 1956, and I was one of the last people to know that I should probably go into some career that involves writing. I went into the Navy when I was just about 20. I enlisted in the Navy, and my dad looked over all these recruiting pamphlets and stuff the Navy sent home with me, and he noticed that one of the they call them ratings in the Navy. The Navy has a ton of different jobs, and it's a great branch of the military for people who want to learn a trade, because the ships all need all these different skills to keep a ship going. So you have carpenters, you have sheet metal workers, pipe fitters, you name it. And they also have journalists on some of the bigger ships and bigger bases. They'll have enlisted journalists that get that training to go out and, you know, cover news events on the base and the bigger ships. But I was convinced at that time in my life I wanted to be a firefighter when I got out. And so I went into the damage control arena of the Navy and all that training. And then once I was in the Navy, I wrote letters a lot. I even bought a typewriter, an old manual typewriter, so I could write letters faster. And I got enough encouragement during those 5 years from friends and family that when I get out, I should go back to school and go into journalism. And so I kind of kept that in mind when I was in my final couple of years in the Navy, and decided I thought I'd give college a shot when I got out. And I never did end up in firefighting. My dad was a firefighter. His dad was a firefighter, and my dad encouraged me in that regard. But he never pressured me, though. He would tell me things like, you know, he thought I'd be a good one because he thought I had what it took for that profession. But then I ended up going into journalism and liking it, and next thing you know, I stayed in it, and I have now been at it, like I say, for over 40 years.
Yeah, and that was one of my questions. So the spark for you to take up a career in writing essentially came from encouragement from other folks.
Yeah.
Where was that kind of spark where you thought this really is the profession that I'm going to do? Where did that come from?
Where I kind of realized I could do it was when I got back to college. I took my first semester back. I took a news writing class, and in that era, they were still new, the actual newspapers had computers that you had keyboards that were on a part of a computer system. But in college, my first semester in the spring of 1981, we still had typewriters in the class and paper and scissors and cut and paste, and it really was cutting and pasting like you like the words say. And I just remember doing these exercises in class where you'd have to do on the spot interviews, then quick write up a story, and then have it changed in midstream, and then kind of start over and redo it. It was good practical lessons to see if you could do it. And I got A's in that class consistently. And at first I thought everyone was getting A's, and I finally started to realize that no, maybe two or three people at the most were getting A's in that class. It was a real tough professor. And I started to realize, oh, maybe I can do this. I just had that confidence. But I as a kid, looking back though, I remember, well, again, it made sense when I looked at it from hindsight and from my dad's point of view, that I remember sitting at a typewriter when I was in fourth grade and writing stories on a typewriter, and just it was probably something in there that, and I always read a lot. I was always from the time I learned how to read, I remember always having books, and I still have some of those books from like when I was maybe 8, 10 years old. And so I was always a big reader. And when I got to college, then it was one of the things that they kind of struck for me was I remember in this English class, it was a summer class I was taking because I was really motivated coming out of the Navy. I was going to go through college in 3 years and just get done and get out there and start working. But so I took summer classes too. And I remember this one summer class in English literature, a girl complaining to the professor about how she thought this is a writing class, literature, and it was English composition, English composition, but we did a lot. And so when this girl whined about all the reading we were doing, this professor just kind of gave her this condescending look and said, "It's real simple. If you don't read, you don't write. At least well." And I never forgot that. And I thought, well, that makes sense. I was always a big reader. I always kind of did writing just for fun when I was a kid. And then when I got to be an adult and actually did it as a profession, I realized, yeah, it's not like the kind of work I did in the Navy where you're on your knees and welding all day and doing what I call real work. But you learn too, though, it's not always fun. It's a lot of pressure and you got to perform. There's no such thing as writer's block. You have to crank that article out, whether you feel good that day or not. Mm-hmm. And so it was those first few years I got working in newspapers, for me, is the best thing that could have happened to me because it was so high pressure. And but then you realize too, that's why so many journalists in that era were drunkards and bad smokers and killed themselves before they got to their 60s. And there's just really a lot of people like that would just, they just go at it. And I never had that sense of I'm in a terrible profession that way, because I always figured you can always control things like drinking and smoking. You can't use that as an excuse for
right.
We always had to live that lifestyle to succeed.
Yeah, and obviously, you took a track towards outdoor writing. How did outdoors and your writing career sort of come together?
Yeah, I knew by the time I was in journalism in the classes in college that I wanted outdoor writing, and my big dream job, the job I really coveted, was the Milwaukee Journal job. I grew up reading guys like Jay Reed and later Ron Lays when I was older, and there was a guy really far back in my history, Mel Ellis, who and then Don Johnson at the Milwaukee Sentinel. I always covered one of those Milwaukee jobs in the newspaper in the outdoors. And then the way it turned out, I down the road a ways, I actually interviewed for the job um, one time and was in the running another time. But that's when the newspapers were kind of fading, and they hired from within the first time, and then the second time I was already in my 50s, and I think, they probably really didn't want to hire me. It was already, kind of getting over that 50 barrier. So I never got any of those jobs, but along the way, then I realized, well, there's other jobs in the outdoors. It's like in Oshkosh, I covered the outdoors. I weaseled my way into things in Oshkosh, where I started off on the sports desk. I worked part-time during college in the sports desk, knowing that the way you got to the outdoors and newspapers in that era was through the sports department. As the sports editor almost always controlled the outdoor page. And usually sports editors had no interest in the outdoors, but they were stuck with that outdoor page. And so I just realized there's a little what do you call it? A little crack in the armor where I could squeeze in there and do that guy a favor, but also be doing myself a bigger favor by taking over the outdoors. So that's kind of why I got into sports. I wasn't really ever all that interested in those sports. I could cover football and baseball and those kind of things, but I didn't really know the sports that well. I'm a football fan, but I didn't know how to do I didn't know how to keep a baseball box score. I didn't know all the rules of baseball. I played baseball, but I didn't really play at a level where you have to learn all the nuances of it. And so I fumbled my way through sports, covering basketball games and high school games, and the first chance I had after about 2 years, I jumped out of there, went into the reporting on the at Oshkosh schools, the public schools. So I covered school board meetings, and then sometimes I'd fill in for the city council meetings, police beat once in a while I'd fill in there, and so I got that nice, well-rounded experience at the newspaper. And then along the way, I ended up in the outdoors full time though was I always knew if I wanted to work full time in the outdoors, eventually I would have to leave that newspaper because it was a small daily in Oshkosh. I think our circulation back in that era was 25,000, 30,000 subscribers. And so I thought, well, it'd be either I'll get out and go into magazines or hopefully stay in newspapers, but it just didn't work out that way. My first good job offer after about 8 years at the newspaper was to be editor at Deer and Deer Hunting magazine, which really fit my interests. I was always into deer hunting.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a kid I loved small game hunting, and everyone back in the early 70s, late 60s, when I was coming of age, we all hunted everything. You hunt. It was like I always kind of think it was kind of like any other advancement where you start off on squirrels and rabbits and advance to deer. And deer wasn't like something we did and thought about year round though back then. These days, that whole idea of spring scouting was kind of like a big step forward back in I'd say by that time it's late 80s, early 90s, where you start getting some guys who were real serious about it year round. But then Deer and Deer Hunting magazine came along, and I had been covering issues around the region. And one of their co-founders, I interviewed him a number of times for different conservation type articles in that area. And I must have done a decent job because he remembered me and called me when they had a job opening for an associate editor. And then when I interviewed for the job, I quickly sensed that what they're really after was a guy to replace the editor and basically make it easy for them to move him out and kind of start over, because they had hired a guy who wasn't working out, and it was optional at first, but then eventually the job did open up, and I became editor fairly quickly. I did that for almost 11 years before I started freelancing full time.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious about your time at Deer and Deer Hunting from a couple of standpoints. But I did want to ask, growing up in Madison, How did you get into the outdoor pursuits? Was it a family thing?
Yeah, it's that's always well, I find that whole thing just a fascinating endeavor because honestly, my dad wasn't a huge hunter or fisherman. We had guns around, we had fishing equipment around, but Dad's interest in fishing and hunting was pretty um, superficial. And he was a really good shot. The guy could, I think he's one of the best shots I've ever seen, just picking up a rifle offhand and shooting something. And I know he was in the army and trained, for them, but I think he's had a natural gift for shooting and never really, it didn't really trigger him, no pun intended, like some things, that he was interested in. But his dad was a more serious hunter and fisherman. My three brothers, two of them don't do any hunting and fishing anymore. Dad always took us fishing and took us hunting every now and then for a small game. But he had really lost his interest in deer hunting by the time I came along. And so, like in my family, my three brothers, as soon as they didn't have to go hunting, they didn't go. And where I just kept going, and I was the only one that Dad ever bought a gun for. You could tell that who's really interested in this and who's not. And so I was always interested in hunting, and I was always reading Outdoor Life and joining the Outdoor Life book club and reading all the I was one of those kids that and people that thought when you signed a little card saying that you would agree to buy X number of books over the next year, you took that as a very serious thing. They'd come arrest you if you didn't buy your quota of books. So I remember buying this four books for $1 entry thing, and then really making sure I paid for another 3 or 4 books to fulfill my obligations.
Right.
I look back on that now after a career in publishing and realized, oh, you sucker! They would have just kept sending me that stuff. But but again, I guess I get thing too though that it's nice to know that my parents instilled in me certain awareness and ethic that you don't walk away from your obligations like that. So
Yeah.
I just find it funny because then I end up in this career where I see every freaking thing imaginable to get people to subscribe to magazines and newspapers and buy books and all this kind of stuff. And you realize, that if you drop off, they'll keep coming after you.
Yeah.
But it gets to come back into the fold.
Yeah. One of the reasons that I think I'm so taken with outdoor writers is I really there's a couple of points in my life that I think are really tangible moments for me and that involve outdoor writers and outdoor writing and I really wonder for myself if I would have gone down the same track I did without and one of them is my mom's dad who was also in the Navy and thanks for your service, Pat, by the way. But my mom's dad had a great big book, a Jack O'Connor book, Big Game of North America, and it's got beautiful pictures in it. But from the earliest time that I can remember, I remember going to their house and when I was there, I would seek that book out. And, I'm sure I read that thing cover to cover like 10 times. And I remember thinking like, I got to get to one of these Western states, that has all this, some of this diversity of North American big game. And, again, I think that is one of those tangible things that outdoor writing really gave me. And I feel really fortunate to, I've had the life that I've had and the career that I've had. And some of it, really comes from being enamored of outdoor writers, like Jack O'Connor and Jim Zumbo and Jim Carmichael and, and so many others and more in the magazine trend. But I certainly was a reader of deer and deer hunting
Yeah.
when you were there and again, I think part of the magic for this for me is I was so taken with that stuff, particularly at those ages, because I know that you were at deer and deer hunting when I was really into reading everything I could get my hands on, because I just saw something the other day about you and about deer and deer hunting with the Mitch Rampolla buck,
Right, right.
and because you were the editor there when that was going on, right?
Yeah, yeah.
For I'm sure most of the folks listen don't remember this story as much as I do, and you were really close to it. But could you just briefly rehash that one?
I'll do my best. Because I haven't stayed on top of that story. Um, and this goes back now, must have been the late 90s, I think it was. But Mitch Rampolla, I was aware of him before this all happened, where he shot this big buck that would have beaten Milo Hansen's world record if he'd ever gone through and gotten it officially scored. And but Rampolla had a pretty good track record for shooting big bucks that not not world record class bucks, but big bucks, and consistently was shooting big bucks. And as I recall, he shot this buck, and it was big. They had pictures of it at a registration station. He had different, at least one warden that had looked at it. He had like three scorers from the Michigan scoring organization score it. So these weren't just self-scored handlers. It was people that had some credibility. So I remember calling the three guys who scored it at their homes at night and just interviewing them, and they all stood by it. And they struck me as being really good, credible people. But there were things about that buck that you had to look at it sideways a little bit, like it's already called the space between the brow tines was really odd. They were
Mm-hmm.
like outside the inside part of the rack where they usually sit. So it's some really odd configurations, and he refused to get it scored. He refused to get it X-rayed, and so there's all these accusations that it was just cobbled together antlers. And then when I remember we worked with through a guy that worked with Mitch. He's like his agent or something, and we ran some articles about it. Ran his story about how it happened and how he got it, and it was always controversial from the start. And to this day, I have to say, I still can't say for certain whether I believe him or not. We had the story about him, and I at one point I wanted to kill the story and just move on from it, but I got overruled by my boss, and I still don't know if she was right or if I was right. But I was never willing to throw the guy under the bus, though, because the biggest thing for me was those three guys in the scoring organization. And again, it might be my own prejudice, but I've worked with those kind of people a lot in my career. These guys who work for these state scoring organizations in Boone and Crockett, they're all Boone and Crockett scorers too. And these type of people, they tend to be the hardest skeptics of them all.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen every trick imaginable of guys trying to pull off crap with antlers.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact these three guys stood by that buck, I had a hard time arguing with them, because I think, well, they actually had their hands on it. But to this day, it's Rampolla never did get that buck officially scored, and we never will know until he's gone and that somebody else gets their hands on that rack, if it was something they cobbled together. But another thing that always kind of stuck in my mind was that when we got a picture of the buck finally after it was mounted, it was a terrible mount. It was just a goofy looking mount to that buck. And I thought, here's this buck that's supposed to be a potential world record. And I wondered if Rampolla mounted himself, because it really looks like something that you or I would have done up on the weekend. Just really I like taxidermy. I like the full shoulder mounts. And over the years, I got pretty good at just walking into a gallery, a mounted deer, and size them up pretty quickly about which one's the good taxidermist. And this was not a good example of taxidermy. So I thought, how could a guy that can't even put together a good mount of that buck could have put together antlers that fooled these scorers?
Oh,
So I thought,
that's an
you know,
interesting perspective.
yeah, that's why I thought. Yeah, I've been asked these questions over the years, like, well, how'd you get involved in this, and what do you think? And now I say, well, I'm still torn, but then I was stuck in my mind that how could you have if you tricked these guys? If it's the same guy who did that rack, I mean that mount, I just don't know how you do it. I just there's something there that just doesn't make sense to me that you could fool these guys like that.
Yeah, I mean, it was such an interesting time in deer hunting too,
Yeah,
and I feel like I was so into it because what Milo Hansen, for those of you who don't know, he's the world record holder for whitetail, which is a huge deal. And that buck he must have killed like early 90s, 92 maybe.
93, I think it was.
Okay.
Yeah,
Which so I was born in 80. I was 13 then. I was in middle school. All my buddies it was all about deer hunting every day. And then the Rampolla buck comes along a couple years later, and I'm helping out at a taxidermist shop. And I just remember, like, I felt like for months, like we just talked about that deer. And I bet the Deer and Deer Hunting magazine was probably passed around the taxidermy shop 100 times.
I I still have some copies of it down the basement, and I I always thought it'd be fun, to get a little panel of taxidermists and have them, look at just the pictures alone and break down what's wrong with this mount.
Yeah,
Pictures alone, they could probably give you real good nuance on what is going on with that thing. But I thought, when I'm being fair, though, I think, yeah, that'd be a crap. That'd be just basically a turkey shoot, where just beating the guy up. And the thing too, Mike, that always struck me about the whole thing, people always said, why doesn't he just get it mounted or scored? It'd be so easy just put this behind him, just score it. And on the other hand, I know some people, not many, but I know some people who really, they wouldn't get it scored either. I can just see
mm,
them digging their heels. The first sign of controversy, the first sign of doubt, and the backstabbing that goes on among deer hunters, and say, "Screw this, I'm not doing it."
yeah,
I can just see them shutting down, and that'd be it. And chances are we're not going to know for certain until around Pola's kids or grandkids or distant nephews, who knows, gets their hands in that rack after he's gone, and then we'll probably learn what really was going on there. It's kind of like these days with the Epstein files and the JFK assassination files. These
yeah,
kind of things that we just get so wrapped up around the axolon that I guess I've been around long enough now to where I just kind of realized too, as a reporter, you pound and pound and pound in some stories and learn all you can, interview all the experts you can, and you still can't really quite know for certain what happened. You
yeah.
know, like right now, I'm working on a 50th anniversary article about the Fitzgerald sinking, and you read all these really good books and watch some of the interviews with some of these experts in shipbuilding and sailing the Great Lakes, and you realize that ships in the bottom of the lake for 50 years now, we probably never really will know for sure what happened. I have my thoughts on what probably happened just based on my little knowledge of human nature and not liking to do tedious jobs. And you look at those ships and the hatch covers on those big freighters, and the job of going around and fastening down all those clamps,
Hmm.
hundreds of clamps. And I remember just in my days in the Navy how much I hated to dog down 8 clamps on one door. And so I think, well, human nature being what it is, I wouldn't doubt they cut a lot of corners and more than even the captain probably realized, and it killed them. But anyway, I'm off on a tangent here, but I just find this stuff. that Rampolla story, it's funny how I cannot um, tell you the details like some guys can because I moved on. When nothing finally faded away, I didn't think about it for years.
Mm-hmm.
I just have this faith that at some point we'll know for certain. I might not be around when we learn that, but at some point we'll probably get a pretty good read on what and whether or not this is legitimate or not. And it's I think it's one thing I really enjoy about deer, and I've said this 1,000 times, is deer make people stupid. And I don't know what it is. Nothing else out there that we hunt or fish compares. We just see some really screwball behaviors. Everything from winter feeding. People still pass cans around to collect money to go feed deer in the winter, thinking they're somehow helping, even though it's that definition of insanity over and over again, and yet they keep doing it. And they can't justify going out and feeding a small group of deer basically and thinking they're somehow saving the Northwoods deer herd.
Yeah.
As you can see, I go off on tangents real fast.
No, tangents. The podcast's all about tangents, Pat.
Well, good. But I think that's why I ended up at deer and deer hunting years ago, is because I goose hunted, I hunted ducks. But when I look back on my hunting interests, when I got hooked on deer hunting when I was about 15, it never stopped. I just always loved it. To this day, when I sit on a deer tree stand, it can get hard to sit there all day, but I've done it a lot, and I just think it's something pretty magical about the animal that I've never been an antler geek. I'm not good at looking at racks from a distance and sizing them up like some guys can do. They're walking in a room with all these racks laying there and just go bang, 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 give estimates on what the scores are. I just never been into scoring, and none of the bucks I've shot in my life ever officially scored. I just think it's just kind of I find the whole scoring thing is a nice little reference, and that's about as far as I go.
I couldn't agree with you more, Pat. We've in fact, it's kind of interesting. Caitlin has killed 2 really nice elk in the last 2 years.
Yeah, you bring up that one that she shot this year, and I thought, God,
yeah. And those are she had the first one scored, and it made Pope and Young, and she's going to have this one scored, and it's kind of like, well, do you want to do this? And we kind of talked about it because we're not score people either, but she said, I'm doing this because I want my great grandkids to be able to say my great grandma is in the Pope and Young book.
I think that's it's funny how, if I were her or a husband, I'd be say, you get this thing officially scored, because I always feel, maybe it's because I have 3 daughters, but I always feel like when it comes to women in the hunting sphere and the fishing sphere, I get kind of protective of them. I get kind of annoyed with men who always are so quick to write off a woman's success as basically just benefiting from her husband's help or whatever it might be.
Yep.
And then the thing I'll always defend them on is, yeah, but unless that husband pulled the trigger and shot the bow, whatever it might be, I've seen lots of men over the years have a big animal in front of them and melt down, and I think I start feeling my knees start knocking. And when you see some of these women stand in there and put that shot on the spot, I think you can't take that away from them.
Oh,
and I'll never ever if I ever find myself attacking a woman with those kind of arguments just without really knowing anything about her, I'll know it's time for me to get out of this business and go be put in a nursing home or something. I've met enough women who are really good hunters where I respect the hell out of what they can do. And I know, like my own daughter, Leah, who hunts, on her wedding day, I remember in my little Father of the Bride speech, I made a joke about, but I was also serious because it came out of respect. I said, I looked across the room at her husband and said, just so you know, Dave, Leah doesn't shoot much, but when the gun goes off, something drops. She just doesn't miss.
Yeah, Caitlin is just, I mean, it's grace under pressure, but it's toughness too. I mean,
Yeah.
I've not hunted with anybody tougher.
Mhm.
And I think that's normal with women. I really do.
Yeah, I've heard from a couple of different guys who teach hunter ed and shooting instruction, and they always say how women tend to learn how to shoot faster than men. A lot of it's because men don't listen. They think they know enough already. They blow off advice, where a woman listens to the advice and tries to put it into her approach.
Yep. Pat, you mentioned going off on tangents, and it really kind of made me wonder, is going off on tangents an advantage for somebody like you? I mean, is it the tangent? Is it the strings to pull at that are interesting?
Yeah, I really think that's a big part of being a good writer, is seeing things that other people don't see, and seeing one thing I was always good at early in my career. I started noticing it was something I did a lot, that I'd read other people's outdoor articles on various issues or stories or whatever it might be, and I come across one sentence, one point. I thought, huh, that's the thing I want to dig into. But I think you have to have that ear for interesting tidbits that other people might overlook, and that you can see there's just something there that's got a little more to it than this guy. This guy kind of glanced over it. But then I think too, I've had enough of my own stories where I look back at them years later and realize, why didn't I pursue this angle or that angle? But I think it is having that ear for um, the unusual, the quirky, something that's just out of the ordinary. But the thing too that I think makes a good writer is they know the topic so well. They know when they're presenting good information that's fairly new, or for first time.
Mm.
And you can't put out good articles with fresh information if you don't know the information already and really know the background of stuff. And when you start covering it, breaking new ground on something that you just know you've been reading about this stuff for years, and this is something that's new. And then it comes down to presenting it in a way that people find it interesting too, and don't just glaze over. Because there's times where it's interesting how I'll write something, some guys will see that nugget and see that nuance there might be, and get their eyes light up, and other people just go right about their business and never see it. So it's just but I think you have to have that curiosity and that willingness to dig into something and find out if there's more to it than what meets the eye.
Is there ever been a story that you've either written or worked on that you just kind of can't believe didn't land or wasn't a bigger story?
Ah, God, that's a great question. I know there's one because I just can't. Doesn't come to mind right now because I know there's something in the back of my head that says, I know what you mean. I just can't think of what it was right now. And because one of the advantages of getting old is that you do see things from a different perspective as you get older. You have more experience, you have more things you draw on, and more sources. My sources today, a lot of them have retired or died, but I still write down the names of everybody I interview and get their phone numbers and contact information. But the other disadvantage is that you start getting to the point where you have so much information up here that sometimes you just can't. The filing system just doesn't open to the right drawer, right folder anymore. And I can't tell you, but I know as soon as we hang up now that it'll come to mind what it was.
Well, this is almost better for me, Pat, because now you'll think of it and then you'll tell me, and then I'll be like, well, now you got to come on the podcast again.
Right. But there is one thing that I always find fun, like in recent years, is it's getting harder to find markets for it. but I was always one of the reporters here in Wisconsin that covered chronic wasting disease probably more than anyone. I wrote a lot of stuff for the last 20 some years on CWD. And but to the point now where a lot of people they're tired of hearing it. Even when there's fresher information out, they don't want to hear it. But I always think every now and then I'll come across stuff and think, well, this guy mentioned this years ago, and that state tried to implement this stuff and just politically didn't fly with people. So now we're stuck with a real mess, and I want to know how we're going to get out of it. But I still feel like looking back, I feel like, well, I gave it my best shot. I tried to put information out there that was good and solid, and when things change, I accept the fact in the scientific process we'll always keep learning, we'll always keep advancing, but along the way we'll make some mistakes, and because I always think we're human, we all make mistakes. So, and their assumptions they had at certain points, yeah, they got wrong, but I think the thing I'll always give the science profession and the scientific approach is that they know it's always going to be a matter of questioning and prodding and pulling stuff out, and sometimes moving on from that and just realizing they were wrong on something. But they're always questioning and digging and probing and doing new research. And but one of the fun things for me though too, Mike, is I go to a lot of these scientific conferences and listen to presentations by grad students and agency people, and it's fun on a personal level to realize too that these are scientific minds at work, but deep down inside they're still petty people.
Sure.
They have the same insecurities the rest of us have. And even though they're very learned men and women, they can get real defensive and prickly about someone questioning their findings from 2 decades ago. And even if the process now has improved, they still want to fight it. They don't like to give an inch on giving up some idea they had, that is kind of looking a little bit more iffy now. But I write it off as hey, I get it. I think I'd probably be just as prickly, just as skeptical, and just as pissed that somebody's questioning my findings from my work. So but I think that's how science. That's what I think one of the things I respect about it.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, the science-based management approach, is you're going to learn that you're wrong sometimes. That's just a fact of the business.
Yeah.
Pat, you mentioned MeatEater earlier, and I want to talk about that from a couple standpoints. One, you and I was fortunate enough to meet you through a mutual friend, through Carl Malcolm, who is kind of a MeatEater connection too. But how did you come to that community and start writing for them?
It was pretty just one-on-one type stuff. Where it's funny how life works. One of my big newspaper clients that bought my column for over 30 years was the Wisconsin State Journal in Madison. They started buying my column back in about 1991. And along the way, one of my readers is Doug Durin. Doug had been reading my stuff for years, and Doug started really getting in touch with me pretty regularly during the CWD days, early days of CWD, and sometimes even arguing with me a little bit via email on various management ideas. But Doug's always one of these guys that Doug lives out there in the Richland County area, at least he did back then, and where CWD quite wasn't there yet. But Doug's a pretty smart guy, paid attention, knew that chances are it's going to show up at some point in his backyard because it's only 40 miles away. And anyway, Doug, at one point back around 2009, he invited me out to hunt with him a couple of times, and I never took him up on it at first because I had relatives at the farm just down the road from him, so I was always hunting their farm. I really didn't need another place to hunt. But then just the way the schedule works out sometimes, this one hunt he invited me on, I went down, made it, shot a deer And by hanging around Doug's for a couple of days, I realized this guy's got some good stories to tell, and he's a good, smart guy, and I enjoyed hanging around him. And a year later, he calls me up and says, "Hey, I'm gonna put together a little writers' hump. There's just two of you." And he says, "Have you ever heard of Steve Ranella?" And I said, "No, I really didn't know the guy." And he says, "Well, he wrote a great book called American Buffalo. He's going to be here, things like the first week of January in 2010. And want to know if I want to come down." And I would have come down anyway, but I said, "Yeah, that sounds interesting." I came down, and then it was funny. Once we started talking, and I started, my little mind started, wheels started turning, and I finally realized I know Steve Ranella because I remember my wife a year or two earlier had told me one day that at at National Public Radio, they had this guy on midday, and he said, this guy's going to be on talking about hunting. And I was real skeptical because I thought so often people come on radio, whether it's national TV or national radio, and they just don't do a good job representing hunting. And so I thought, well, geez, he's going to be on this midday show that it was done by a NPR radio lady that was really good. So I listened to it, and I kept finding myself nodding along, agreeing with what Steve was saying, and how he answered questions. I was really impressed with his the depth and breadth of his knowledge, and just the sincerity of the guy. And it finally clicked. I remember Steve Ranella now. And so when Steve and I were talking, that's how we kind of connected a little bit. Was I could put those that interview he'd done and put a face on now. And so then Steve kept coming down to Doug's for various projects that he was working on. And I only got down there a couple of times when Steve was around. But Steve too was also at the time freelancing some writing. So he would call me every now and then for like for sources, who's a good guy to talk to on this topic? Who do you talk to at this magazine? That kind of thing. And so we just kind of always stayed in touch that way. And I learned later that he was still he's always a voracious reader. So he'd read articles, and once in a while he'd stumble across one of mine. And one that he stumbled across was an article I wrote that looked into the idea of is it time that we start looking at the idea of letting people sell their venison? We have these areas of the country that are overpopulated with deer, and no matter what we try, the average American hunter will shoot like 1.3 deer a year. You give them all these tags, and they still only shoot 1.3 deer a year. But I thought, well, you give them a little financial incentive, maybe it's worth exploring. And the way I explored it was talking to people in Europe and Sweden in particular about how their system works. How do they have good moose populations? And I think they have roe deer over there, and maybe some red stags maybe. But they you can walk right into the stores in Stockholm, and the prices on wild meat are right there in the public store that you can buy. And so I thought, well, it's being done some places. And I always say too, the Americans we're smart people. If we set our minds to something, we can find ways around these obstacles and make these things work. We somehow survived letting people sell antlers and selling hides, whatever it might be. So we can probably find ways to regulate this. But anyway, Steve happened to read that article, and I think it was in Bow Hunting World magazine or one of those magazines that used to be by the same company. And he read the article, and he said he was getting kind of annoyed with it. Went back and paged back to the front like all people do to see, well, who wrote this? He was, Pat Durkin. Little was made me laugh. That's how he kind of. But I thought, well, again, we were talking earlier about you never know who's reading, you never know who's watching, and that was one of those cases where I must have made an impression on Steve that wasn't a totally bad impression. So,
right.
But when he launched MeatEater in its form that it is today, back in 2018, he asked me if I, want to do some writing for them. And so that was, as I always say, you don't say no to Steve Ranella. So I was busy as hell at the time already, but I thought I'm not going to turn down that opportunity. And then end of this day now, I'm still do. I don't write from as fast as much as I was for several years there, just because I'm going to be 70 here in a few months, and I don't want to be working at that pace anymore where I was for 30, 40, 50 years almost. And so I'm kind of backing off a little bit, but I don't think I'll ever totally retire. It's just I like what I'm doing too much.
Yeah. It's interesting you brought up NPR there, because I think, and I don't know, it may have been Here and Now or Fresh Air. I think it was Here and Now that I heard him on.
I can't remember, but I just remember being impressed. That always kills me when I listen to the average hunter try to talk to non-hunters about why we hunt, why it's important. They tend to fall back on things that don't connect with people. And like when I'm, we don't shoot the deer, overpopulate, have diseases and all these kind of things that, yeah, but that's not why you hunt.
Right.
It might be a benefit of it for the animal, but that's not why you hunt. And Steve did not have those kind of explanations. He talked in real terms with people. And once I got to know him a little bit, I realized the reason he can do that probably is because, he grew up in Michigan in a real hunting area. His dad was a hunter and fisherman. So he grew up in a real good hunting, fishing, trapping background. And then he lived in New York City for a long time, or at least a good number of years, and hung around a lot of non-hunters, had a really good feel for how they look at hunting and how, for them, hunting just isn't on their radar.
Right.
And you can't expect people who know nothing about it to understand some of these arguments that we make. And I think Steve just learned those aren't arguments that sell the everyday person on the street. So I think he has this good, rich mix of education and real life experiences that I always say that's why I always consider him our best ambassador, for hunting.
Yeah, I agree. So Pat, when we met, we were just kind of reminiscing about this. It was COVID. I think it was January of 2020, right?
Yeah.
And I was excited to meet you because I was familiar with some of your MeatEater work. But one of the things that really drew me to you is that you love yellow perch, and nobody that loves yellow perch can be bad. Where'd that come from?
That goes back into my early days, where I think the first two fish I remember catching were bluegills one day and a perch the next. And I was probably 8 years old, fishing with a cane pole. And then I grew up in Madison, and so where I grew up, I could walk basically a mile to get down to the lake. And so I could pull a ice fishing sled down there. I could walk down there with a 2-man rubber raft that I had bought from the Army Navy surplus, and plus my dad took us fishing. But in ice fishing, oh God, a couple years that I was in high school, I got so into perch fishing in the winter, ice fishing, that I just fell in love with that. And plus in the summer, they were called perch fleets. There'd be these, you see boats on Lake Mendota just all piled into one little area on the west side of the lake. If people are listening and know where Middleton, Wisconsin is, right next to Madison, but Lake Mendota butts up on the west end by Middleton, and on the other side of that west end is in Madison. But also you get those perch were always accessible. When they were biting, I could paddle up to them in my little rubber raft, drop an anchor and then fish with drop lines. And I'd be lucky to the most I ever caught in one night. You fished till dusk basically. I think the biggest catch I ever had was only 18 perch, and more often I'd catch 7 or 8 of them. And then I loved doing it. And the thing I learned too was I was filleting fish by the time I was 12 or 13, learned how to fillet fish, not just my dad taught me to clean fish the way he cleaned them was just cut up the heads and gut them and scale them, and then they would just cook them up and pull them apart and flip the bones off the side. Then when I learned how to fillet them, well, my mom liked that so much that I never went back to the regular old way of doing it. They liked eating those bone-free fish, and so it's one of those things. Where, as a kid, you realized you're making the adults happy when you brought home these perch dinners, and so that was just I think one of the first real awareness I had that if you feed people something they like, you're gold, you know.
Yeah.
They were never. My mom wasn't very receptive toward game animals, as far as cooking those, but cooking fish, man, you could tell that made her day when she could cook, fresh fish out of the lakes.
Yeah, I absolutely love the idea with hunting and fishing and the food component of it. I love that you can turn the joy of being out there and doing the thing in the outdoors, into food, into joy.
Yeah, 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 and it was a fun time too because looking back, I realized mom and dad and my grandmother, my dad's mother lived with us, and for them, I got to hear these really good stories growing up from my grandmother about how tough things were when she was raising her kids. It was, my dad was born in 1929, and there's, basically the depression was going on, and the stock market had collapsed in 29, and so they didn't, and basically her husband and her, my grandfather had some real drinking problems, so he wasn't around very often, and so she had a rough time, raising four kids. But every now and then they get a rabbit, or they go fishing, bring home bullheads, and bullheads were a real big deal back in that era. The water quality in a lot of lakes in the upper Great Lakes were pretty bad back in 100 years ago, and so but the only fish they could get sometimes was bullheads. And there's actually I did a story for MeatEater one time about the bullhead market. It used to be a commercial market on bullheads back in the 1930s over in Minnesota in this region that I live in. And so anyway, that was just always to me a good firsthand look at what life was really like for people when times were hard. And that's where I can get off on a real tangent about why I worry about our country today is I think, my generation, the baby boomer generation, I just think we grew up at a very, very good time. And it bugged me when people my age don't realize how good they've had it. And it also bothers me they don't seem to realize what a terrible job we did passing on the gifts that our parents gave us. We're saddling our kids with all this debt now and all these things that I worry about. And I still think, well, you do what you can. And so what I'm trying to do now to do what I can is teach my grandkids how to hunt and fish and enjoy those natural things. But it is, I think too, there's a certain spark there for kids who like to hunt and fish. Yeah, that spark was obvious in me, and I see it in some of my grandsons. That boy, you can tell this is hardwired stuff. The fish, that fish hits that bait and it pulls that cork under, or they feel it on the end of the rod, and they become just. You can tell they're just excited. It's fun to see how those little kids respond because it's so visceral and so immediate.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that some stuff goes into us that probably into our genes that some people don't quite get that sensation that others do. So it's fun.
No, I probably my proudest moment of the year was I had our two boys walleye fishing, Caitlin and I, and the boys went walleye fishing, and we were trolling, and we hooked a fish, and I was like, "All right, guys," and Emmett, the 4-year-old, cranked on the rod, and Robert, the 7-year-old, netted the fish, and we slung the fish in the boat, and I said, "Teamwork," and Emmett said, "Makes the dream work." So. Yeah, it's really great to to see kids connect
Yeah.
with it. And, you know, anybody. I mean, it's fun. It's fun in the same way when you get to spend time with somebody that hasn't had the same experience, but you get to see the same spark.
Yeah. Well, these things are can be lifetime activities. That's but the thing I keep trying to preach to my grandkids too is that, you know, take care of yourself. You can enjoy all this stuff a lot longer than if you don't take care of yourself. And so I try to take these little opportunities to plant those ideas because I think, you know, it's just I'm seeing it firsthand basically, you know, that you know, if you don't take care of yourself, I've already lost friends, and you know, when they in some cases they took very good care of themselves, but they didn't get the luck of the draw I've had with the genes and whatever, and they died early. And so I think, well, you can't control your genes. You can control some of your habits and your lifestyle choices. But I try not to get too preachy with a little 7-year-old about it. But I try to, you know, try to lead by example and, you know, share your passions. And like one thing I did that you'll probably get a kick out of is I I found a way of acquiring my grandfather's book. It was called Iowa Fish and Fishing. It was a book put out in the 1950s, and it had these colored plates by one of those famous artists from that era. And the fish in those colored plates, his paintings look so realistic. You think you're looking at a good high res picture of a sunfish or a bluegill or whatever it might be, a yellow perch. And I grew up reading that book. And I had my grandfather's name in it, Edward P. Durkin. And like I say, I don't know how I did it, but somehow that book stayed in my possession into my adulthood. So it was always in my library. I got back in the Navy, and somehow I still had the book in my possession. And so I've had it in my house for decades. And when my 7-year-old grandson Connor, it was pretty obvious of my grandkids that this kid is just really into fishing. It just he was IDing fish at first glance when he's like 5 years old. You know, fish would flop on the ice and he goes, "Is that a pike? Is that a northern pike?" And he'd use the full name, northern pike, you know, and I started to realize, this is not just this kid's into it. He's just not waiting for me to ID the fish. He's studying the stuff. And then I learned too that he was watching fishing videos and learning how to hold that rod and set the hook and put that rod a little bit farther and feel for that extra little tick, you know. And then I learned that he's also a good hockey player. And my daughter says, yeah, he'll watch hockey and then pick up moves by watching those hockey players. And next thing you know, he's out in the rink doing it, you know. So I think, yeah, some kids just have that ability. Like, I wish I had that for dancing or something because I can't dance, but I always admire these people that can watch something and then mimic it, you know. And I see that with him being able to do that with whether it's fishing, all this. You see all that little nuance that the little kid's already picking up. It's just fun to see. So anyway, I gave that book to him, and I had a little sit down and say, you might forget this years from now, but I want you to have this book. It was my grandfather's book, and I want you to keep it and, you know, pass it on to your grandkid. You know, so we'll see.
Good for you, Pat. It's important, I think, to have people like you for kids. You know, to keep this all going. It you know, it takes some level of tradition, I think, and people who want to teach it. So it's great.
You and you could talk about this too. Is when I was growing up, my parents, my dad, my grandfather, they were not worried about raising the next generation of hunters. You know, it
Yeah.
just wasn't what they talked about or thought about. They just you went hunting, and so I think sometimes too, when I'm all for these different programs to get kids introduced to it and get people from different communities who haven't been exposed to it to introduce them to hunting and fishing. But I always think you can introduce them to it, but then at some point, if the interest is there, they gotta do it on their own. You can't just you know, you need those mentors to get them started and be with them early. But you know, my friends and I, we typically fished on our own. We get together and go fishing, and we get together and go hunting. We somehow didn't kill each other along the way, but we didn't. But I think our parents really weren't that involved. We didn't really have mentors like we talk about today, I think, but yet somehow my generation produced a lot of hunters, just a lot of fishermen. It's just really, but I think it's probably just a unique timing of events that kind of created a lot of that.
Yeah, the world has really changed even in my time. You know, 100% product of deer camp culture in Pennsylvania. Lived down in the southeast part of the state, had a deer camp that was 4 hours away in north central PA. And, it was kind of a big deal when I was young if there was going to be enough beds. I mean, there'd be 23, 25 guys in camp. And now there are years that they're not sure anybody will go. And, if there's half a dozen people there, that's a big year. And the world has just changed in that way.
Yeah, and I don't know. The one thing I don't worry a whole lot about um, where it's going. I just figure, well, we do what we can do, and it's got to take care of itself at some point. But then you think too, hunting is carried on in the German culture, the Swiss and Sweden cultures, and they don't have the numbers we have, but yet, I mean, they're really minuscule numbers compared to ours. But I just think it's probably we're probably going to just keep shrinking down to a certain level before it levels off again or it levels off. But I've seen it in here in Wisconsin. We went from 700,000 license sales in 1990 down to about 550 these days. And so when I hear people say that hunting isn't being affected, that's just exaggerated stuff. And I think no, in the eastern part of the country, numbers have shrunk. The western states, no, they haven't lost hunters like the East has. But
Yeah.
I've seen it, with my own eyes, where the woods that used to have orange dots all over it on opening day of gun season, they aren't there anymore. And the gunshots you used to be able to, you need one of those little clickers to keep track of the gunshots. Now you can do it in your head. It's just a lot fewer people out there.
Yeah. Well, Pat, as 100% predicted, I think I've probably asked you about a tenth of the stuff that I'm really curious about. I wanted to mention just a couple of things. One, you are a marathon runner, which is amazing to me. And then the other thing that you do that is, I mean, I respect the heck out of it, and I don't think I would ever do it myself. Is even as a Midwesterner, you do a lot of elk hunting and quite a bit of it solo. And man, that is serious business that you're taking on there.
It's I never elk hunted until I was 49 years old. And I always say it's because I was not in good shape earlier in life, but plus I just didn't have opportunities. I was so focused on deer and so focused into the deer world in my work that I just did not have time to go out west and hunt elk. But then when I was like in my late 40s, I lost a lot of weight, got into shape, and then I started running just for fitness basically. But then as it went on, I started to find running satisfying in its own right, and so I got into marathon running a lot. But the elk hunting, I'm not a good elk hunter, but I'm a persistent elk hunter. I in recent years, as my health has gone downhill a little bit with age, I found I can't chase after them like I could at first. But I was never a great caller anyway, and I thought elk don't move around the landscape like deer do, where you can kind of predict over time where your best odds at intercepting them are. But they do have you can find certain pinch points on the terrain that they somehow come through there at some point. And I had the patience to sit there and wait for them in a tree stand. So I've done that. When I switched to tree stand hunting about 8, 9 years ago in Idaho, and I'm personally not fussy either. I'll shoot basically the first good opportunity I get because I love elk meat. And so I find all that stuff. I like those physical challenges, and it's just plus it's just a magical area. These mountains that we have in our country and public lands. When people talk about public lands, I think, yeah, I respect that. I mean, it's cool to think you can go up in northern Wisconsin and hunt big deer in these public lands that we have in Wisconsin, and go out west and hunt elk. And and as long as you're willing to make that investment over time and keep doing it, so you build up a certain knowledge of an area. And it's not easy to do though because of our tag system and drawing tags and whatever. But it can be done, and I've gotten out there enough times where I might not be a great elk hunter, but I'm a persistent one.
Man, I love that about you, Pat. It's one, it resonates with me when you say you're not a good elk hunter, because I'm not a good elk hunter either. But, hunting them is the only way to get them, just like everything else. And that resonates. So I hope that you'll come back on the podcast again sometime and let's talk all about how you elk hunt, because I think it's super interesting how you found success.
But great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, and real quick before we go, we talked about it a little bit before we actually started the episode, but one piece of advice. If somebody said, I am determined to get into outdoor writing or outdoor journalism, what's Pat Durkin's one piece of advice for him?
It's gotten really hard, Mike, because the way I got into it was kind of a traditional way of doing it, back when we had newspapers and magazines and stuff. So these days, I've not figured out social media. And I think I'm at an age now where I don't really care if I do, but I do see, the one thing I'll always, come back to when you get right down to it, the people that make this work, they're hard workers. That's one thing they all have in common. They work their butts off. And I still think there's so much to be said for going through and getting that formal education, whether it's in communications or journalism or theater, whatever it might be, that gets you in there. Other people I know have gone through the science side of it through wildlife management. They get a degree in wildlife biology, but it's something that really they really are good at, but they really have this deep interest in. And the way I made a living, the thing I kept in mind, and I always had to tell people this, that I think they're going to go hunting the rest of their life, is I rode the desk much more than I ever rode inside a truck or up in a tree stand, wherever it might be. I really lived behind the desk I'm sitting at right now for decades, and I think I love the outdoors. I love hunting and fishing. I love conservation, all the things that I covered. But I always knew that if I want to make a living at this and put my kids through college and put diapers on them when they're younger and all those kind of things, that the only way you can do that is by sitting at the keyboard, at the phone, and calling people and doing their stories and working your butt off at it. And not many people make a living as a freelancer because you just don't get paid a whole lot per piece that you work on. And I wouldn't, these days I wouldn't really know. I would figure it out though. I don't know right now sitting here what I would do if I were starting over. But I know if it mattered to me, I'd figure it out, and I wouldn't give up on it. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people, they don't like paying the dues, and it's because it's the paying the dues is a grind, and it's doing shit you don't want to do in many cases. But I I always like to think that I was always this my friend Heberlein used to refer to me as a prostitute. You'll do anything. I said, yeah, if it's legal and that's what I like doing as far as writing, whatever. I'd always say I could cover anything. I could go out and report on anything. But some things I'm better at. I have that background knowledge in it. But if you're a good reporter, you can pretty much get thrown into a mess and figure out where the story is here and how to report it. And I still think there's always going to be room for those kind of storytellers and reporters out there. But I guess I always start with getting that degree and building those networks you need, meeting other writers and reporters who can vouch for you as you go up the chain. And I know I never ever sell short the people who go and get a master's degree in journalism or there's like Steve Rennell, I think his master's was in creative writing or whatever it was, but basically got his master's in writing. And along the way, though, he met a lot of smart people who had connections, and he was a good writer, and so they helped him out. But you have to have that talent, and then work your ass off to get it even better. And I think those people who had that have the ability to learn, you never stop learning. And sometimes you come across things that just fascinate you and no one else, and you find ways to capitalize on that. So I could talk about that all day, but I do believe in passion. I do believe in finding the right people and whatever, but I still think that, but you got to do it yourself. You got to get out there and put your nose down and grind on stuff. And outwork the other bastards, it's just the way I look.
Yeah, I go back to, I found FFA in high school, and it was really impactful in my life, and I was a vice president. And when you open an FFA meeting, there's a ceremony at the beginning of every meeting, and the vice president has a big role, and everybody has a speaking part. All the officers have a speaking part, and the phrase that I'll never forget is that without hard work, neither knowledge nor wisdom can accomplish much. Yeah. So
I know that. I keep these little sayings around my desk. When I see a saying I like, I'll clip, print it off, clip it out, and put it up. And there's one over here that from Samuel Johnson. He was this English philosopher and writer back in the 1700s. He had a real practical one, and I always thought, this guy figured this out in the 1700s. I better pay attention. But his comment was, no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. And I always get to mind when I start getting myself where I think the one thing I can do is write. So don't spend your time on forums writing for free.
There you go.
When you write, you should be getting paid for it. And that's one other piece of advice I have for people is you gotta get your foot in the door early on. Maybe write for cheap here and there, write for free here and there, but don't make a habit of it. Eventually, you have to start making money at this. And these days, like I said, I don't pretend to know where the money is in the new media today. But if I were a young person going to college, I think that time I came out of college, I probably would have figured it out.
Well, Pat, I just really can't thank you enough for coming on, and I hope that you remember what that story was that we were talking about. I hope that we get a chance to talk all about perch fishing. Maybe we'll do it during ice fishing season and about your elk hunting, but really, thanks again. Thank you so much.
It's fun.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. As always, you can find all of our content on our website, www.outdoorruhls.com. We're on Instagram @Outdoor Ruhls. And, we really value hearing from folks. Shoot us an email, outdoorruhls@gmail.com. All right. Thanks again, Pat.
Good talking to you.
Take care.
Hunting and fishing, the great outdoors, mixing history, laughter, love, and folklore, creating memories with family and friends. These are the trophies that matter in the end. Outdoor Ruhls.